So I'm sitting in the airport at O'Hare in Chicago, and this is about, 20 years ago. I was actually just going to go to Cleveland to give a little presentation, and it was winter. And any of you who've traveled in the winter, you know that sometimes the weather will delay flights, and so I'm sitting at the gate waiting for the flight to take off, and the gate clerk comes out and puts up, this flight's delayed for 20 minutes. And then 20 minutes later, she comes out and says, this flight's delayed for another 20 minutes. And then she comes out and says, this flight's delayed for another 20 minutes. And by then, there was a whole other flight that was supposed to be leaving from that gate, and there was nowhere to sit, and there were tons of people, and there were, a couple kids running around, and, some of us, I'm doing all the math that, all right, I'll get there at 10, I'll get to my hotel at 11, I'll get 7 hours of sleep, no problem. And every time they'd come out, I redid the math, pretty soon I'm like, I can give that talk with 4 hours of sleep, and I can give that talk with 3.5 hours of sleep. And I'm like, oh my God. And everybody's getting frustrated, except there's she was probably about 3 years old, this little toddler who was running around and sort of enjoying this. She's like, adults really do not like this stuff. Toddlers are like, this is awesome. And she's running around picking up sticky stuff and giving it to her parents. And I'm just sitting there daydreaming, and there's a guy sitting next to me who's a corporate traveler, business guy, and he's wearing a very, very, very expensive suit, and he's got his Rolex watch and his fancy Italian loafers, and he's getting increasingly pissed off. And so that she comes out, and the gate clerk puts up, this flight's delayed for another 20 minutes. And he just jumps up and goes over and says, I want to speak to your supervisor. This is completely unacceptable. I have never had this happen to me. I've traveled for whatever, and I am personal friends with so-and-so on the board and all of this stuff. And of course, it was so completely inappropriate that just the entire gate just was like quiet. And watching him, and it was just, he was just such a jerk to this poor woman, and she was very cool and said, I'm sorry, it's the weather. As you can see, the plane is covered in snow. But he was just a jerk, and this little girl is like, wow, this is kind of interesting. This man has power. Everybody stops when he says, and he seems like fun. And so he comes over and sits down, and the little girl comes right over to him and puts her sticky little hands on both of his knees and smiles at him. And I'm going, oh my God. I'm a mandatory reporter. What am I going to do? Now, he looks at her for a second, and she's smiling, and he's scowling. And so he takes his newspaper, and he folds it up in front of her face. And the little girl's like, oh, this must be a game. So she rips the paper out of his hand. And I'm going, oh my God. Because I'm thinking he's going to go crazy on this girl. And the truth was, her internal template was that people are good. And people are fun. And this has to be a game. And the truth is, she was right. So here's this entitled, kind of nasty, irritable old guy. And 5 minutes later, she's riding him through the gate. He's on his hands and knees. And she's riding him through the gate. And I'm just thinking, wow, this is amazing. My impression was completely wrong. But the point is this. This girl elicited from him his best. And it reinforced her worldview that people are good. And if that hadn't happened, it would have just enforced my false worldview that just because you're all dressed up and fancy and hoity-toity, that you're a jerk. Which is that's not true. And so for me, it was a perfect example of how you elicit from the world what you project. Now, I have an opposite experience with a child whose internal template was that she didn't matter. And she had a history of developmental trauma, and she had early attachment disruptions. And I don't know the circumstances necessarily, but we were doing a long observation of a sort of a therapeutic kindergarten. And so we had these videos that were going all the time, and one-way mirrors and that kind of stuff. And we had a little girl in that class who was shy, withdrawn, wouldn't interact with the teachers. And now remember this. See, here's the thing. We've created these relationally impoverished educational environments where you've got one teacher and 20 kids, right? And I talked a little bit yesterday about how relational stuff is rewarding, and eye contact and being in the moment and being present, and these things really are rewarding and regulating for kids. And it's what keeps you sort of motivated as a child to do the right thing. But you've got one teacher, one rewarder, and you've got a bunch of kids. Now, this teacher was very young, very energetic and enthusiastic, and all the kids would come in the morning, and she'd give them all a big hug. And she was all about smiling and being, like talking like a kindergarten teacher, that kind of stuff. Those of you who are kindergarten teachers, don't take it personally, but you talk differently. And so she was one of those sweet people. But even a sweet, nurturing person, when you have this relational demand, can't do this. And what people have studied, and what most of you, if you think about it, you will recognize, is that you end up sort of going back and giving relational reinforcement to people that are giving you feedback that's reciprocal. So the little children that come in and smile and give you a hug, you smile and give them a hug. And all through the day, this teacher was giving all this positive reinforcement to these other kids, and this other child who was withdrawn and disengaged, who had an internal template that people are not safe, finally got to the point where she had seen enough that this teacher maybe was safe. And she was doing something, and for the first time, she sort of reached out of her comfort zone and tried to ask for help. Raised her hand. And she raised her hand and raised her hand. And no, the teacher was over in the corner laughing and interacting with some other kids. And at one point, you just see on the video this crestfallen look of this child as if, I guess I was right. I don't matter. I am invisible. And it just, when we showed this to the teacher, it broke the teacher's heart. She started crying. Because if she'd only sort of seen it, she would have gone over there, but she was engaged with other kids. This is one of the problems with creating relationally impoverished educational settings. If there had been one volunteer in that room, and I'm sure that volunteer would have gone right over and sort of given this child some positive reinforcement that would have let her start to shift this template about the fact that she doesn't matter to people. And this is one of the reasons that we harp all the time about the need to get more people into classrooms, to get more people who are going to be able to provide this kind of relational reward and engagement for these kids, both in a regulating and rewarding way. But those are two sort of examples of your internal template. See, because she was not reciprocating to the teacher literally gave her fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer positive bits of feedback, and her worldview about how I don't matter was reinforced. I mean, it's just like me giving this presentation, right? I remember, you look out in the audience and you see some people that are sleeping, and you see some people that look at you like, oh my God, you're so smart, and of course, you look back at the people that think you're a genius. Yes, I am, and the people that are sleeping, you're like, oh, you ignore them. And so what happens is you start to selectively direct your attention to the people that are reinforcing positive things. And I remember I had to give a presentation once that was on television in Canada, and it was this big thing, and there's a big audience, and for whatever reason, they had to have these lights on me, so I couldn't see anybody. And I usually, I try to make my presentations, I think about it as if I'm talking to a single person, right? So I try to get some connection and see whether things are actually making sense or not. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is going to be tough because I'm not getting any feedback from the audience. But fortunately, some woman came right up front in the front row and sat right there. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I'll kind of use her as sort of my relational reference and see how things are going. And I'm talking all of a sudden. And because it was on this public TV thing, they had this bug in the ear thing in my ear. And so the producer, or whatever they call the person that was sort of managing all of this stuff, all of a sudden, I start to hear, and their audio starts to hear this. And they're like, check your tie, the mic is brushing up against your tie. And I'm trying to talk and look at slides and look at my tie. And I hear this sound. I'm like, what the hell is that? And I look down, and this woman is like, it was like 5 minutes into the presentation. I said, oh my God, I really am bad at this. Anyway, so now, internal template. If you are lucky enough to have this attentive, attuned kind of caregiving, you start to build this very, very powerful, interconnected set of neural networks that become your primary regulatory system. And so, as I talked about before, after you're born, you end up having a whole bunch of other primary caregiving experiences that reinforce that existing association between rhythm, right? So you rock your children, and you have all kinds of rhythmic somatosensory interactions with them that strengthen and extend that association. And part of what happens is, you guys who've studied object relations, is that the cortex, remember I said this is a part of the brain that can tell time, right? And as this part of the brain matures, and you start to have the extension of this primary regulatory network, which is really a set of template memories, you start to be able to do stuff like, when you crawl into a different room, even though your primary regulatory person isn't there, right? Your mother or your granny or whoever. If you hear them, you're able to make an internal representation of who that is, right? They're still here. And there'll be times, all of you can probably remember, there are times when, as a toddler, a child either your child or a child you're working with, goes into a different room and they can't see you, but they'll call out. Sometimes they'll have little hoots like, "Ooh, ooh," and then you'll say still, "I'm here, we're here, it's okay." Or they might use words, but that they're basically trying to sort of really make sure that you're still there. And this is, as you get more mature, this whole sense of object permanence means that when mom isn't there, the child can still conjure up in their head that there is a mom, and that because this is in the time-telling part of your brain, they will come back. They always come back after a certain period of, quote, time. Now, in the beginning, they don't really have this complex sense of time, and that changes as you get older. But ultimately, what happens is we build this very elaborate, internal, interconnected set of memories that allow us to visualize people who we care for, and even in the imagining being with them, it makes us feel good. It makes us feel regulated. This is the power of the cortex. The human cortex is this astounding, astounding part of us that allows us to do these things. And this is why, we can carry people we love around inside of us. And that memory of them can elicit sadness if we miss them. It can elicit joy when we think about some moment we had with them. It's connected to other emotional associations. Now, this is when it goes well. Now, let's talk about traumatic memory first, and then we'll come back and talk about when creating an internal representation goes poorly. So, here you are. Let's say that you've gone through all these developmental experiences and you've had a wonderful, attentive, attuned set of caregivers, and they have been your external stress regulator, and they've built into you the capacity to self-regulate, because now you don't need to rely upon them. You have the ability to move your own body, to go to the refrigerator, make your own sandwich. You have the ability to imagine them as out there somewhere. They're keeping you in mind, and your ability to actually imagine them thinking about you in and of itself is regulating. And those of you who do any sort of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic reading, that whole concept of keeping someone in mind is huge. So, then there's a traumatic experience. Now, and let's pretend this is a capital T trauma. This is a big thing. And what happens is, and I mentioned this yesterday, I said it again today, your brain is kind of always trying to make sense out of the world. And so when something happens that's way outside the realm of your normal experience, and it activates your stress response to try to cope with whatever this impending threat is, you end up recruiting just about every part of your brain. So there's parts of your cortex, parts of the limbic system, parts of the diencephalon, parts of the brainstem that get activated to try to help you make sense out of what the hell is going on right now. And so if you happen to be, and I hope that this is not a trigger for anybody, but if you happen to be going to your car in a parking garage at night, and all of a sudden somebody grabs you and throws you to the ground and puts a gun to your head, and it's this life-threatening experience, what happens is your brain is grasping for straws to make sense out of this. What's going on? How do I make sense out of this? And it will be happening at multiple levels. So your brain will start to make associations and connections between all kinds of things that are present in that moment. And what's present in that moment? Well, you're in a dark, enclosed space. You have the smell of like gasoline and oil. The person who's got their gun to your head, all you see is a little star tattoo in between their forefinger and their thumb, and you smell gunpowder, and your brain is sort of like going, what the hell is going on? And all these things, your brain's trying to make sense out of it, and it connects them. So it makes associations between all those things, and it identifies them all as potentially threatening. And so, a traumatic experience creates a chain of traumatic memory. And so there's memory, as I said, there's the cognitive recollection. I was walking through the parking garage, and then it will create an affect. Oh, I was terrorized and I feel distressed. And down here there'll be specific motor positions. He put me in this position. I was, I had one arm under me, and I had, he sort of pushed me in the middle of my back, and I think his knee was on my back, and the gun was the back of my head, and you also have physiological memories because your heart rate was 110, and then you sort of partially dissociated and kind of had this weird sense of prolonged time. And your brain is all over the place when that happens. And because of this, and I mentioned this, I talked about this yesterday, the event will end. But then what will happen is there will be all kinds of other things that will activate this traumatic chain. You will essentially have an evocative cue. It might be that, the next day when you go to the police station and have to give a statement again, just cognitively thinking about it. Well, let's start with the bottom up. Let's say that on your way to the police station, you have to walk through the police garage. And all of a sudden you find yourself feeling, oh my God, I'm in an enclosed thing with a bunch of cars. And it will literally be reminiscent to the brain of that. There will be an association that, oh, hey, this was threatening before, and all of a sudden it'll activate this whole chain of traumatic memory. And later on, it could be, years later, you're pumping gas at the gas station, and all of a sudden just the wind comes along and you get this specific combination of oil and gas, and you have a panic attack. And sometimes you can connect it to that event, sometimes you can't. But so you have all kinds of ways to have evoked responses. And then you can have top-down recall. Like I said, you go to the police station and they say, tell me about what happened. Well, I was walking along the whatever, and as you talk about it, you start to feel anxious and your heart rate goes up. And so you can have top-down activation of the traumatic memory, and you can have bottom-up activation of the traumatic memory. And the problem is, the more times there are either cognitive recollections of it that are uncontrollable and extreme, or there are bottom-up activations, what you're essentially doing is you're making that memory stronger. Now, the interesting thing, and those of us who've done work with people who've been traumatized, and then you follow them over time, what you find is the response to these cues in the first week after an event is much less intense than the response to these cues after they've created these powerful associations. So in other words, a lot of times people cope much better in the immediate post-acute period than they do 6 months later after they've created this traumatic chain of memories, which becomes a huge problem. Which has led us to develop a whole set of immediate post-event practices that inhibit if you will, the encrusting of these memories. So after 9/11, for example, there were a lot of people that said, oh, we can't take these kids back down there because it will be an evocative cue and they'll be thinking about this, it'll be overwhelming. And I was like, no, what you need to do is they need to go down and they need to have experience after experience after experience where they see that the neighborhood had nothing to do with the trauma. It's not the neighborhood that did this. Because if they don't do that and they think about it and think about it and think about it and think about it and avoid that area, by the time they go back, they're going to have a set of very powerfully built-in associations where they are literally afraid of that neighborhood. And you've allowed their brain to make this false association. You have to put them back in the environment as soon as possible so their brain can only make accurate associations. So what you want to do is, to the degree possible, and let me see if I can actually draw this here. It's completely appropriate to have, let's say, this specific chain right here. But what you really want to do is make sure that all of these chains, that none of this happens, and none of this happens, and none of this happens, and none of that happens. You want to make sure that you break the false associations, and the best way to do that is by taking all these other things that were present at that event and re-exposing the person to them in moderate, controllable doses that are reminiscent of what I've already talked to you about here, right? Now, if you adhere to the principle of specificity, what that tells you is that you cannot change any neural network unless you activate that neural network. So if the neural network that's altered and abnormal are these stress-related, this widely distributed stress-associated chain of traumatic memory, the only way to actually ultimately make those systems less reactive is to do what? Activate them. And this is kind of what the rationale for exposure therapy is. This is what the rationale of TFCBT is. This is what the rationale of a lot of trauma therapies is that you, in a safe environment, have opportunities to revisit that experience in some way where you start to make new default associations about that are not necessarily as destructive as the trauma associations. The problem is this. As I talked about yesterday, 45 minutes once a week is not creating that pattern. So this is why I like things like people keeping a diary, people doing art, play, relational opportunities to have a tiny little dose of revisiting that content, as opposed to expecting that it's all going to happen in one visit. And this is also why I really highly value the pairing of pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activities with a process where you revisit the content. Now, how many of you have heard of EMDR? That's what EMDR does. So, let's talk about this for a second. So if you have a chain of traumatic memory that's in here, this is from your traumatic experience, and all kinds of things, just thinking about it or exposure to some cues from it, activate this whole chain of memory, makes you feel dysregulated, makes you feel anxious, shuts down parts of your cortex, you don't learn as well, you've got all changes in your heart rate, you've got all of these things that are influencing your body and your brain, and it leads to challenges with school, challenges with relationships, and so forth. It impairs your developmental process. You've got the idea, you got to somehow get better. So, a long time ago, I was sitting around. Actually, I wasn't sitting around, I was hiking. And when I'm hiking, I'm walking. But one of the things that happens, at least for me when I'm hiking, is that I have solitude. I almost always feel safe because I feel comfortable in the wild. I'm doing pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity, right? And I'm sort of drifting cognitively. I'm not like, I'm paying attention to my environment, but, parts of my brain are kind of processing in the background. I'm actually partially disengaged. I'm using, part of my brain that's involved in creativity. And so I find it's a very good time to think things through. And I was hiking, and I had come from an environment where I had been working with combat veterans, and we were working on PTSD and trying to heal PTSD and everything. And EMDR had just been introduced, and all of my colleagues were thinking, "Oh, that's a bunch of crap." And there was part of me that said, I don't know that that's necessarily crap. That actually kind of makes sense to me. And, you talk to folks and they say, "What do you mean it makes sense to you? You take your finger and you wiggle it in front of somebody's eyes and all of a sudden their trauma goes away. That seems crazy." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know it kind of seems crazy, but I don't think it's completely crazy." And so I'm walking along, and I had this thought. I said, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with traditional healers that were from Native Americans, and some that were Maori, and some that were Aboriginal from Australia. And I just was sort of drifting along and thinking, EMDR is kind of interesting. And then I realized that, I'm pretty sure that trauma existed before 1980. Pretty sure, And I wonder what other people did when they had trauma. And I was familiar with some of the writings in the Civil War, and I read a lot of history. And then I realized that, I've been talking to these guys, but I haven't been hearing what they've been saying. Every single one of these traditional healers was talking about healing from trauma or doing immediate post-traumatic experience debriefing activities that involved pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity. Before you go on a buffalo hunt, which is highly risky, right? Broken bones, people die, it's high risk. What do? You dance. You have a dance. After the hunt, what do? You dance. And not only do you dance, but everybody gets up and tells their story of what they did in the hunt or what they did on the raid. And they get up and they choose when they want to do it. So sometimes these dances are a couple of days long after a good hunt or a good raid. Now, somebody might have been killed in the hunt, killed in the raid, whatever. There's post-traumatic stuff. There's traumatic stuff that happens. And if there's, it dawned on me that every single culture that I'd learned from or tried to learn about, the way they managed sort of unpredictability, natural disaster, war, death, illness, involved some form of healing process that involved pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity that was coupled with a relationally dense experience where you were trying to reweave and reconnect the community or reweave and reconnect your clan to the natural world. So it was all about connectedness. It was about relationship. It was about rhythm. And then it was about cognitive narrative. There was a story. And so it struck me that these practices recruit and reach every single part of the brain that it has been impacted by a traumatic experience. There's a narrative. And now the interesting thing is the more I thought about it and the more I think about it now, there's the controllability of how the warrior tells his story is part of what makes it healing. If the chief said, hey, you get up and tell your story right now, I want to hear it from beginning to end. I want you to tell exactly everything that happened, and then we'll move on to, Billy over here, and he'll get up and tell the story. It's not the way it works. It's this very dynamic process that when somebody feels like they want to tell part of the story, they get up and they dance and they tell the story of how they snuck up on the horses and then they took the horses. Now, they don't tell the part that the person that was with them got caught, got an arrow in the calf, fell off the horse, broke his arm. They tell that later. And they do it in little doses. And that's why they have these dances that would last a long time. And you start looking at and listening to other cultures, and they've all incorporated the same thing. And so EMDR is sitting with somebody and cognitively recalling the traumatic event, at the same time that you are doing some form of pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity. Now, it started out with sort of bilateral, tracking, eye contact, visual back and forth, but you can do it with bilateral tapping, bilateral auditory stuff. And so it turns out that what is happening when people do this is that when you are in utero and afterwards, you have so many powerful experiences that build into your brain this very, very, very powerful core regulatory network. Now, thinking about the traumatic event actually activates the parts of the brain that make you feel distressed and increases your heart rate, whatever the physiological response is. And that's a complicated thing, but so you've activated this trauma memory, but if you activate that traumatic memory at the same time that you're activating a more powerful memory, you start to short circuit the associations in your brain between the cognitive recollection of the event and the affective and physiological distress that go with the event. And if you have a very discrete experience, you can actually deal with that and disconnect those things very quickly. It can actually be a couple of sessions. And when people hear that, they're like, oh, that sounds crazy. But when you do it, it's incredibly powerful. Now, where it becomes a little bit challenging is when there isn't a whole lot of specific cognitive recollection of an event. Now, but the same principles hold. You can use rhythm to regulate kids to visit any kind of emotionally charged content. So when you walk with somebody and talk and you're in parallel, you're going to get much further in dosing, they'll be able to tolerate a larger dose of revisiting than if you make them not move and sit face to face. If you make them sit face to face with you, and let's talk about the house fire, they'll basically try to please you a little bit, but then they'll start using all kinds of techniques to avoid going there. And if you keep pushing, they'll actually disrupt. And they might, you will provoke behavioral problems through your good intentions that are developmentally uninformed. But if you walk side by side with the child and say, hey, have you been thinking about the house fire? You will be much more likely to give them the opportunity to actually visit that content in a way that they're regulated enough. In other words, you're giving them an opportunity for a moderate dose. So, ultimately, what can happen is that you create a new default set of associations between the traumatic event and lower parts of the brain. And the earlier you do this sort of rhythmic intervention, the more likely you are to essentially replace the default from the traumatic experience. So I've had several discussions with a group of Israeli psychiatrists who have been using EMDR immediately after a traumatic event, either combat or whatever, and it's very, very successful. And when I spoke last year at the European EMDR conference about this, they were all excited because this has kind of explained what they've been observing. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that I think one of the things that we all too often don't do with these kids is appreciate the power of rhythm and somatosensory activities in making them capable of connecting with us. And I'll bet all of you, as you think about if you've adopted a child or you work with adoptive kids, you probably have had way more fun with them when you're doing stuff in parallel with them and you're like washing dishes or playing cards than if you're face to face and saying, tell me what's going on in your head. And I would encourage you to think a little bit more about that. Now, we're going to stop like at 11, which is like in 10 minutes. And I just want to let you know, number one, there's more stuff to learn like this. And you can get, like I said yesterday, you can get some of this content from our website. But I would encourage you to reach out to people in your community who are learning about these ideas and concepts and stay open to them. And I want to end with one last concept that is really, really, it takes a lot of this stuff that you've already learned, and it kind of puts a few things in context, and we refer to this kind of as the principle that we label this principle the intimacy barrier. And I want you to learn about it because it is something that appears to be present in so many of these kids' lives. And so let's just start out with, you remember how I was talking about you make your associations about what people mean based upon your catalog of early experiences. And so, I showed earlier sort of the green, the mother who had this healthy relational stuff and illustrated that with this green circle. You may have a mother who's really depressed. And so that mother is going to be giving you different kinds of somatosensory interactions than a mother who's not depressed and fully engaged and well-regulated and so forth. And you might have a caregiver who's dysregulated and actually episodically demonstrating rage behavior. And most of us end up actually having a whole combination of these different kinds of primary relational experiences. Even if you have a wonderful caregiver, there are going to be moments when they're frustrated, and there are going to be moments when they're exhausted, and there are going to be moments when you're not that special. You're just one of the kids. And so we all build these internal catalogs. And so if you are lucky enough to have one of these primary caregivers or a set of primary caregivers who pretty much think you're the center of the universe, And you're continually getting this feedback that, oh, you're so special, and you're so wonderful, and you get all this stuff. You grow up, and you have this catalog of essentially nonverbal language, nonverbal cues, and relational experience that reflect those experiences. And you walk around thinking people are good, and I'm special, and I just smile a little bit, and you're going to smile back at me, reinforcing how special I am. And then there's people that kind of get a little bit more realistic view of the world. And, there are moments when they're special, but, they may be one of 5 siblings, and they get a lot of the signal that, yeah, I love you when you really fuss, and I'll meet your needs fundamentally, but I got a lot of kids out here, so I'm going to take care of this one, and this one, and this one, and you're one of the group. But you're not all that special. And then you get kids who have a caregiver who's depressed, or a caregiver who's really dysregulated and potentially abusive. And so everybody in this room has an internal catalog of sort of experience that comes from these primary relationships. And whether you're aware of it or not, that internal catalog influences the way you interact with people. It influences what you project. It influences how you interpret what people feed back to you. And I think everybody's probably has experience with friends who, you can be really up and enthusiastic and things are going well, and they're always like, well, but this could happen. And you're like, well, it didn't happen, and you just won the lottery, so can you be happy? And they're like, well, I've heard bad stories about people that win the lottery. Really bad stuff come, people come out of the woodwork, and, most of those people are broke in 2 years. Like, oh, yeah, well, give it back. Give the money back. I'm sick of this. Anyway, and then you have people that, horrible things happen to them, and they're like, oh, we'll get through this. We'll be fine. And you're like, maybe not. The flood of your whole freaking house is gone. That's not going to go well. Oh, we'll fine. Okay. So we all have these internal sort of views of the world, and I could go on and on, but this is what I want to talk about. These internal catalogs sort of create for you a sense of how safe relational engagement is. And so if you have, on whole, positive relational history, you can have casual interactions with people, and you tend to feel safe, and they tend to be regulating and rewarding. And so you can actually have a really nice, positive human interaction with somebody you sit next to at the airport. They're completely new, and you have a conversation. And it can be positive. And you can then go, and if you go to work and you have these routine, protocolized interactions where everybody knows the rules and you feel safe and you can interact, and then you can go and have personal interactions with people, like your neighbor can come and say, how are the kids? And you go, fine. And you feel safe. You don't feel threatened. And again, these can be rewarding and regulating interactions because your internal neurobiology of relational stuff is, on the whole, pretty solid. But everybody, no matter what, is at some point is going to feel like their relational boundaries are being violated. And this can either be through content, things people say, or it can be through things people do. Physical proximity. So how many of you have seen the Seinfeld episode about close talkers, right? So everybody has this sense of proximity that if somebody gets past that, it's like, and this distance can be very, very culturally bound. It can depend upon your developmental history. For example, if you go to prisons or you go to a juvenile justice setting, the sense of personal space that you feel comfortable with is actually a space that so for example, if you think it's a social space, that you're not violating anybody's personal space, and you start talking with those folks, you're highly likely to be in their personal space. Because their circle of personal space is about 1.5 feet further out than yours is. And so again, this leads to all kinds of problems with people who don't understand the neuroscience of trauma. If people have hurt you in the past, your sense of your personal space being violated is going to be a lot further out than somebody who's actually had positive human interactions where people have hugged you and told you you're special. So, one of the things that happens with most of the kids that we work with is that they have a mixture. They've had some good experiences and they've had some bad experiences, but a lot of unpredictability. So I'm going to talk about two things, and I'm going to push past time. Is it okay if I push 5 minutes past time? 3 minutes? I have to stop right now? All right.
It's okay, really. I mean, no.
She said it was okay. She said it's not her fault.
Keep going.
I didn't read the memo. That's why. I thought I was going to end at 11:30. So, otherwise, as you can tell, I would have really planned this out. So a couple examples of violations of personal space. I love to tell these stories because it makes people laugh. And so here's the first example from my life of a violation of personal space. It makes a point. I just moved to Houston from Chicago. My neighbor comes up to me and says, hi, how are you? And I'm mowing the lawn, right? I'm mowing the lawn, and I got the lawnmower going, and he comes over to talk to me. So I put the lawnmower in idle, and he says, hey, listen, I got to ask you a question. Now, I don't know him very well. I just met him like at a block party. And he says, listen, are you having sex with your wife this weekend? I was like, huh. So now, if I could flock, I would have flocked, right? If there'd been somebody around to look at it and go, did you hear that? I would have done that, but there was nobody there. So I went to the next stage of the fight or flight response, which is freeze, and I didn't say anything. So he repeated, he said, and listen, did you have sex, and how many times are you going to have sex this weekend? And I started going, oh my God, and I'm like, I'm frozen. And so the next step is flight, and then fight. And so I sat there for a minute and I thought, all right, the window's faced that way and the shades, and I'm like thinking, why is he asking this question? And he said, listen, it's really important to me. And I literally said, listen, I got to go. I fled. I went in the house. So the point is this: when somebody crosses your intimacy barrier, it activates your fight or flight response. And you will either, if you dissociate as a predominant mode, you'll shut down. But if you use a fight or flight response, you'll sort of escalate and you'll go, if you can flee, you will flee. Now, if you are a foster kid and you're new to a neighborhood and you start at school and you have a positive, casual interactions go okay, routine interactions with if everything's predictable and you know how to act at school, that's okay. And then you go out at lunch where there's more unstructured opportunities for social interaction and some kid comes up to you and says, hey, where are you from? And it's an innocent, actually probably a positive comment from a kid trying to engage you, but for you to ask a foster kid where you're from is actually, for most of them, an evocative cue. And so that's crossing their intimacy barrier, and they respond by a fight or flight response. So either they try to push somebody away by calling them a name, or they get aggressive. Now remember, my curve, remember the curve I showed you, that my stress reactivity curve was linear. One of these kids' stress reactivity curve is not. It's that red curve that you go from 0 to 80, just like that. And so if a kid comes up and says, where are you from, to a foster kid at lunch, the foster kid is just likely to go and push the kid. And the kid will go, what's with you? And it'll end up being a fight. And of course, because the teacher has heard about this kid that's in the class, everything will be blamed on the foster kid. And he'll get in trouble. And then he'll come home and he'll throw down his books and he'll say, I hate school. And now the foster mother, because she's got a big heart, and because she's using what we call theory of mind, which means, if I felt bad, I would want somebody to come over and hug me and ask me how I'm doing. And he basically does not want that. So the foster parent comes over and says, "What happened?" And he says, "Leave me alone." And of course, what do we do when they say, "Leave me alone"? Oh, every one of us just leaves. Oh, okay, great. I'll just give you your personal space and be off on my way because I know all about developmental reactivity and relational sensitivity. No, we go, "Oh, it's okay, tell me." And we get close and we try to be nurturing, and they will get more vile, more aggressive. "I'm going to kill you. I hate you." And if you keep saying, "Oh, why are you saying that?" And they'll hit you. And so oftentimes the people that they care for the most are the ones that they're the most aggressive to, and they push back the most. And they use this threatening language and this violent behavior to essentially reestablish the intimacy barrier. Now here's the interesting thing. I'll talk about this. Here's another example. I'm in California giving a presentation. I'll make this very fast. Afterwards, people come up and want to talk, usually ask questions, and there's a group of people there, and a woman parts the way, comes forward. She's wearing long flowing robes and lots of rings and lots of jewelry. And she kind of looks at me and she says, "You know, I can tell from your aura that you're a very sexual person." What the fuck? What? I'm from North Dakota. We don't have auras. I mean, it's like, it's too cold. They don't come out. They just... I did flock, and I looked at the other people, and they're like laughing at me, like, "Oh my God, can you believe she said that?" And so she gets closer, and I'm thinking, oh, she's gonna want to shake hands, so she grabs my hand, and then she pulls me close and hugs me, and I'm like, oh God, and I'm trying to go, okay, I'll use my words, and I'm like, not much of a hugger, and then all of a sudden I feel. She's licking my neck. Now here's, right. And then I'm like, push her away. I said, "Listen, I got to go." And I left. And I get out in the parking lot. I realize I left my computer on the lectern. And I'm like, I cannot go back in there. So I hid in the bushes until everybody left. Anyway, so now here's the point. I know it's kind of funny, but here's the point. I actually kind of like my neck being licked, you know. But I like to control who licks my neck and when. And so it's not that this little boy didn't want a hug. In fact, he actually wasn't globally touch defensive. The night before, he'd crawled into this woman's arms and wanted to be rocked and held. And so now when she wants to give him nurturing and rocking and loving, she's completely confused by the fact that he is aggressive and hateful and pushes her away. And the whole thing is all about controllability. When he closes the distance to be physically affectionate, that's great. When you close the distance to be physically affectionate, that's a violation of the intimacy barrier, and it will elicit a reaction. And so I wanted to talk about that because this is one of the most common areas of misunderstanding and challenge for parents who are taking care of these kids. He said, the more nurturing you are sometimes, the more crap you get. And part of what you really need to learn how to do is be present and parallel and give them control over the process of dyadic engagement, both around emotional content and around physical affection. And so I can't tell you how many times I've talked to families where there'll be one partner, one parent will be kind of the person that maybe likes to work in the shop and go fishing and do stuff. And then the other parent is kind of the primary nurturer, right? Is the lovey, cuddly, I'll take care of all this stuff. The person who's most loving gets the most crap, and the guy who's kind of sort of distant and not really disengaged, but like not all about exploring your inner world, you know. Pretty much, it's okay if we just fish, okay? That person has an easier time with these kids. And so I can't tell you how often I actually have to give the advice to folks that, listen, you have to back off on the nurturing. You have to recognize that sometimes it's more loving to be less physical, less sort of emotionally focused, and have them shadow you. Like, hey, let's go weed the garden. Let's go plant some flowers. Let's go, let's color in parallel. And what you'll find is I talked about it yesterday, when you're driving in parallel with these kids, they'll tell you so much more than when you're sitting down and going, what happened at school? Nothing. It's a hard thing to do, particularly with this group. So, oddly enough, I'm going to end by saying, I want you to remember what I said about self-care. You've got to be regulated if you're going to help these kids regulate. But the other thing is, it's okay to not be so over-attentive. It's okay. It's okay to just be present. Give them control of their own dosing process, because you aren't going to be able to tell what a moderate dose of revisiting is. Only they can tell you. And sometimes that moderate revisiting dose is going to be something as brief as one comment, one sentence. But I can guarantee you, if you stay parallel, they're going to be able to come, and if they allow you across the intimacy barrier and you're respectful and you're quiet, they'll invite you back. And you'll start having more and more repetitions. And the more they feel comfortable with you in close to them, the more they'll feel comfortable talking with you about stuff. But it's tough work. And it's not, it's something that only can happen if there's adequate relational presence. I talked about this before. One of the biggest challenges that we have is that everywhere these kids go, they're in environments. Everywhere all of our kids go, they're in environments of relational poverty. Even if you're a healthy kid and you've got no trauma and you're from a healthy family, there are inadequate relational opportunities for you. You are not as well connected to your neighborhood, to your extended family, as would be optimal. Our current world is, we have to make some choices about how we teach our kids to manage and regulate screen time. We have to figure out how we manage and regulate screen time. We have to make some choices about how we think about a whole range of child rearing, mental health service delivery, juvenile justice, child welfare settings. And I think we have to stop being so obsessed about programs and be more focused on people. Because when you look at across all therapeutic modalities and do meta-analysis of what works, it turns out that every single one of the therapeutic approaches are equivalent in effectiveness. Psychodynamic, play, CBT, even psychopharmacology. But the one element that turns out to be the mutative or that change agent is the relationship. So it's the person who's prescribing or playing or CBTing that makes the difference. It's not necessarily the technique. So, and again, that brings me back to you. If you don't take care of yourselves, if you're not regulated, no matter what modality you're using, no matter what way you're trying to change this child, as a parent, a therapist, a teacher, whatever, you will be less effective if you are not regulated yourself. So, I'll end with that. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your work. I hope the rest of the conference goes well. I'm sorry I went late. I cut into your dancing time.